All right, good morning, everyone. And thank you for attending this webinar on automation enablement, making automation work for your enterprise. Today, you'll hear from Brent Melson as he takes us through a step-by-step approach organizations may follow from automation workshop planning, training and coaching for teams, automation test creation and execution, script and architecture quality review, and perhaps most importantly, automation measurement and reporting. Today's session will be recorded and will be made available on our website afterwards. We will be accepting questions through the chat window of GoToWebinar. So if any questions come up during the presentation, please feel free to type those directly into the chat window, and we will leave 10 minutes at the end of the session to review questions from the audience. So without further delay, I'll pass to Brent.
Thanks, Virginia. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us here. Just what can I say about this slide? I guess COVID has taken its toll. That's the pre-COVID Brent. Don't look like that anymore. But anybody that's got 25 years in test design and automation probably needs a little seasoning for others to take them too. So I've been around quite a bit, done a lot of automation, and what I'm going to talk through today is a service offering that we have. But this isn't a sales pitch or anything. This is meant to kind of show the types of things that we do when we help our customers enable automation inside their organizations. So realistically, I'm going to go through some best practices that we recommend, how you can conduct an assessment workshop for your teams, the overall enablement for training and coaching, how to do quality reviews and how to measure. And then I'll kind of summarize, and we can have some Q&A after that. And please, if you have any questions, just write them down and then stick them in the chat, and Virginia will do them during the Q&A session. So our automation enablement methodology is really, it's not so much around like actually executing automation. That's a part of it, as you can imagine, but it's really around a set of activities that you can do as an organization to make automation successful. So we're going to be going through that sort of pie charty looking thing in the left-hand side there in great detail during this webinar. Those are kind of the key components that we see around activities that you can do that will make automation successful for you. And why do we do automation, right? Well, maybe spend a couple minutes here talking about automation and what its purpose is and why we want to do it. It certainly can save us money in the long run, and it can make testing activities more reproducible and consistent, et cetera. So we see automation as a key component to the way that you approach quality as an org. And how you approach that can have a really big impact on your success. So this methodology is there to help you identify types of automation or types of activities that by automating them, you're going to get the greatest return on investment. And we're going to talk about the way that you can provide direction for your team and training for your team to get them up to speed on delivering those types of things. We will, talk a little bit about the way that you can integrate in code reviews and other types of things. And one of the themes you'll probably hear me speak about throughout this is the idea that you need to treat your automation activities as a development project. A lot of times we see them kind of treated more as a testing project, the same way you might treat creating a set of requirements and test cases off of those requirements and writing those test cases. And there is an aspect of that. You obviously need to do that for automation as well. But in the end of the day, writing test automation is a development project. And so by treating it that way, you're going to be much more successful. So we're trying to save money, we're trying to save time, we're trying to reduce error. What types of ways can we do this? So you may be familiar with the infamous testing pyramid. I'm a big believer in it. I think it kind of shows how you can build different types of test activities in a way that is much more efficient. So you see the unit and integration tests at the bottom. Obviously, some of this conversation I'll be talking about projects that you're also the developer of. In other words, you have complete control over the code of the product, and then some things that you're going to want to automate are either vendor products or outside your control. So if you're not the developer, then obviously unit testing is not going to be something that you're able to do. However, you can require that your vendors kind of show you how they're doing unit testing. And so this is, if you're not buying at COTS, if it's not off the shelf, we strongly suggest that you talk to your vendors and get them to tell you what types of testing they've done before they send it to you. So the idea there on this testing pyramid, right, is that unit tests and to some extent integration tests they run the fastest, they're easiest to automate, and you basically can create lots and lots of them because you do them while you're developing. As you move up the pyramid, you start testing your APIs and maybe doing some integration regression testing, and then at the top of the pyramid is the user interface automation. And then we never need to, we don't ever want to forget about our manual testing, which is always going to be there. You're going to have some amount of UAT and probably professional testing that happens at the top of the pyramid, especially on new features and things that have changed. So what do we get by implementing it this way? Well, one of the problems that you may be facing in your organization is sometimes called the ice cream cone anti-pattern, which is down there in the lower right. That's where your testing activities on a product are dominated by your manual tests. And, some amount of manual testing, like I said, is always going to be required. But then the first thing that you try to automate is your user interface. And then, then your integration tests, and then you might think about unit testing. One of the challenges of integrating unit testing is that, it is expensive in terms of your developers have to spend extra time writing those unit tests. But a lot of what you get from test automation is around the concept of shift left, meaning that you find the bug sooner after it's been introduced than you would during manual testing. So the sooner you can test after a change has been made to code, the better. And when you have this anti-pattern here, you're often not finding bugs until the developers might not even know when they've introduced it. So, if we take our automation goals to decrease the time spent on manual testing, to improve your product quality, to improve your speed to market, reduce your delivery costs by consolidating all your testing efforts, and expanding your test coverage by pushing down in the pyramid and organizing your test automation so that you've got more integration tests and then API tests and then your UI tests. And the UI test automation can be built on the foundation of knowing that those API tests and integration tests have already passed. It means that you can simplify those UI automations in such a way to get a much more efficient kind of test activity. So prioritizing that automation, to get the most beneficial test cases and to test appropriately at the level is an important piece of it. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about a variety of different activities, but one thing that I did want to talk about is how this methodology can layer on to your development process. And I'm going to choose Scrum. Scrum is pretty popular. Obviously, this was developed for a particular customer and that uses Scrum, but you can layer on these activities into any software development lifecycle process, even waterfall. So, but just to take Scrum and take you through it, and this kind of calls back to that what I was talking about in terms of treating automation as a development activity. If you're doing Scrum, you probably want to use Scrum for your automation activities as well. And so when you're generating user stories for your product, you're going to also be generating your automation stories. And when you're grooming your backlog and selecting your sprints and doing your sprint planning, you're going to also do the same thing for your automation. And you might be automating something that's not in this sprint, right? You might be automating last sprint's functionality, for example. But you do still want to go through the activity of doing your sprint planning. And then as you're in your sprint process, you're going to be developing, and you're going to be code reviewing the automation. You're going to be, pair programming or whatever it is that you might be doing inside your Scrum process, and finishing off those automation user stories and completing the definition of done for those things. And then, at your daily Scrum, the automation team is going to be talking about what's going on with the automation, any progress, what their plans, what roadblocks there are, so that developers of the product can actually participate in that. So as you can kind of see, right, the automation kind of latches on to your software development lifecycle process. And if you do it that way, it can be significantly more successful for you. So let's dive in now to the actual, set of enablement processes that we do. So the first one, and, I would argue that, a good foundation, gets you well begun. The first thing that we definitely recommend is that you do these automation workshops. And the primary goal of an automation workshop is to identify what parts of your application to be tested make the most sense to automate. So we are gathering together information around what the architecture is, how much time you're currently spending testing and where that testing effort is going, what parts of manual testing are actually difficult to do, which ones are easy to do, and which ones might be taking a lot of time and extremely tedious. So this is the workshops that we recommend are a variation on the Three Amigos, which is a kind of an agile tenet for software development. And it just gets the right people in the room. So you do need the business stakeholders, because they can tell you what's important and what's not. So you don't want to, go herring off and automate something that has low business value, even if it's like a little bit irritating to do manual, because in a manual situation, you can decide not to do it for a particular regression or something along those lines. Whereas if you've got it automated, it's always going to be done. So you need those business SMEs in the room. Obviously, your technical SMEs, that can be your developers, that can also be the BAs, and is almost always senior QA staff that are responsible, today for the quality of that product. And so they keep us all honest, right? They make sure that we understand what's actually going into the testing, why the testing was created in the first place, and where they think there are gaps that automation might be able to cover, so that, as you develop this automation, it can start to give you better code coverage and better functional coverage. And then you need some automation SMEs in there as well. So these are the folks that are going to be responsible for actually creating the automation. They understand the way automation works. They understand what it's good at and what it's not good at. And getting that group together in these workshops, and then taking the team through the various kind of testing activities that you have, is a way to kind of develop a quantitative roadmap for creating your automation. So there are a couple of phases here in terms of this workshop process. So, we recommend that there is a prep phase. So that's where you gather those architectural diagrams, so everybody's kind of on the same page in terms of the way what your testing is put together, what the process is for doing those tests. You definitely need to make sure you understand the environments and how those change, where test data might be. Also some discussion of what the product requirements are, just in terms of making sure that you're getting good requirement coverage as you develop the test automation. Probably the most important thing is, in almost all cases, right, you're going to be replacing some manual process. So you need those manual test cases, and you need to figure out which one of those, kind of have them broken down in terms of which ones are always done, which ones are your regression cases, which ones are typically problematic. So looking at some test execution history can actually be quite useful there as well. And then, kind of a little bit of an inventory of any test automation that already exists. Let me take a second here to talk about test automation. When I say that, I don't necessarily mean you always have to be automating the process of implementing a test case. Sometimes test automation is actually, for example, setting up a bunch of test data. That's still, even if all that does is enable your manual team to be significantly faster, that's still in what I would consider to be test automation. So when I say test automation, I am kind of talking about any kinds of software code that will kind of automate a process that you have to do in terms of validating your quality. So you prep all of these things up for your workshop, and then you have all that documentation kind of gathered together and ready to go. And actually the creation of those artifacts, if you will, right, the saving out of all the manual test cases, et cetera, kind of preps everybody for the workshop itself. And then we recommend you conduct a workshop. So that workshop has all of those stakeholders that I mentioned before. Usually you want to cover, they're not short, but they're not super long. You're not going to talk about like days of this kind of thing, right? When we do them for about 3 hours, and we try to cover about 4 different processes that might be nominated for automation. And a process that might be nominated would be like maybe a new customer onboarding process. So that's a thing that has like a test repository about it. Might have a test plan, might have a test suite, and you go through that in the workshop. You go over the manual test cases. You talk about how much effort there is, how much effort you'd like to be, and you kind of develop how much time will it take to write an automation to do that, how much time will be saved, as well as making sure you go in eyes wide open about how much time is still going to need to be taken to maintain the automation, as well as run it and read the output, et cetera. And then, you really want to have like a findings review. And this findings review goes throughout the kind of wheel process that I'm going over today. This is like a written documentation that says, here's what our plan was for the automation. We plan to save, 100 person hours per month. And all of the decisions that came during the workshop that led to that, those are now documented as goals for the automation team to try to meet. And so as you're measuring your KPIs and measuring the success of your automation, you're always going to refer back to this. That's not to say that, you're punished if you don't meet those things. And sometimes, like early on in this workshop process, you may significantly under or overestimate how much effort is required. But now you're automating to a plan, and if that plan has to change, then you're changing it on purpose, and everybody is kind of aware of why the automation is not driving the value, or maybe the automation is driving more value than you had originally estimated. So again, just kind of in summary, we're doing this to make sure we understand the types of testing activities that are happening now, and how we're going to, which of those we're likely to want to automate. We're making sure that we write down what we think we're going to get in terms of time savings, how it's going to improve our process. A lot of times you may find that the ROI is actually quite thin in replacing manual testing, because you're doing less of it than you wish you'd be able to do. So you have to kind of take that less direct ROI into account, and make sure that that's incorporated into the value that you're generating. And then, of course, we always think about automation as generating, at least on the regression side, more reproducible and accurate testing results. And then, out of that workshop comes a roadmap for what you're going to automate. So that leads us into our next pie piece, which is training and coaching. So this one and the next one are obviously pretty intertwined, right? The next one is the creation of the automation. So after your workshop, you've got your candidates for automation, and you may even have some thoughts about like this one's an API test versus this one's a user interface test. And so you've got a little bit of a plan for like what areas of your application you're likely to want to automate. Now you have to figure out, do you have the right team for it, and how can you skill up your team? So we strongly recommend that you have a kind of codified process for making sure that happens. Making sure you skill them up, make sure that as you're choosing testing tools, we'll go through that a little bit during the automation creation section, but as you're choosing testing tools, that you're getting your automators the right experience with that. And we kind of see two types of automator come in. One would be, well, the perfect situation would be like an SDET, right? That's a software development engineer and test. These are folks that have basically have their careers focused on being automation engineers and software developers and testers, and kind of the Venn diagram intersection of all of those things. But those are relatively rare. And so, what we see our customers doing is they're bringing developers over. And so they're having to train their developers on how to test properly. And then the other side, that's often the case, is that you take your manual test resources and you skill them up in writing automations. So now, they are very good at understanding the tests and why the tests exist, but they might need some fundamentals on development. So creating a coaching and guidance model for that is very important, to kind of put that to make sure that your team is prepared to deliver the value that you want to get from your automation. So this guidance model, right, is kind of, and this again is kind of calling through to agile teams, but you could do this in waterfall. It's, agile just tends to be where we are focused these days. Most of our customers are either developing in agile or are making a transition to agile. And certainly almost all of our customers, including, and when we deliver automation, we write the automation in an agile fashion, just because we tend not to have a giant roadmap of exactly what we want to build, when we're going to build it, and, kind of have that thrown over the transom at us. We're often kind of figuring out what to automate on a sprint by sprint basis. So, identifying who knows what, that's your first step. You want to kind of start to build in code reviews and automation coaches. So identify the people that are on the team that can coach the other team members through. If you've got a combination of that situation I was talking about before, where you've got developers that need to learn test and testers that need to learn how to develop, and they're on the same automation team, they can actually cover each other's gaps, and they can learn a lot from each other. The coaches can also help on things that are a little bit more automation specific, like building automation frameworks. And frameworks in automation, right, are like shortcuts, if you will, to help the automation not need as much maintenance. So for example, if you change a login method, you can actually go into the code, change the automation login method, and you don't have to go into every single script and make a change there. It's changed for all of those things. So those frameworks are really helpful. And so automation coaches drive that training into your team. And then, building in, and you'll hear me talk about like after the automation creation side, the quality reviews. So one thing that the quality reviews will kind of push back into your coaching and guidance model is who might need more training, right? Whose automations are actually having more difficulty running, they're producing more false positives, they're not finding issues, et cetera. So you can use that as a feedback loop into this automation training and coaching to make sure that you get your entire team, kind of kicking on all cylinders and knowing the processes and how to build the most effective automations for your group. So that kind of continuous improvement kind of drives into this coaching and guidance model. So automation creation, this is obviously this is the biggest part of it. You're going to write an automation, and then you have to, this automation that you're writing has to meet all the goals and plans that you had for where to drive value out of it. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this today because again, this is more about enabling your entire organization. But as I said, I'm gonna say this many times during this. Treat your automation as development. Make sure that you have a software development lifecycle. Whether that's if it's Scrum, if it's Kanban, if you're going to do it waterfall and you're going to write specifications for it, whatever you decide to do in terms of writing or what software development lifecycle method you want to use, make sure that you have one for your automation creation. Make sure that you use source code control. We often see organizations that use source code control religiously on their development side just have their test automations kind of sitting on automators' desktops, and they don't put it into source code control. They don't manage it. They don't have it versioned properly. Those kinds of things. So make sure that you're doing those activities. Manage it just like you would any of your other development projects. A lot of times the first activity that you do for an automation creation is a proof of concept on specific tools. So, during your workshop, you've kind of chosen, and this is where automation creation kind of jumps ahead of the training and coaching one, but during your workshop, you identified the pieces that you want to automate. Now you've got a choice of tools. And so what tools are you going to choose? And I'm going to go into, on the next slide, I'm going to go into some additional details about, the types of tools that you might choose, et cetera. But as you're doing that, you need folks in the room that are going to be telling you, well, we're going to change the user interface over from MVC to Angular, or, I'm just kind of throwing out an example there. But those types of like long-term architectural changes can drive what you want in terms of tool choice. So make sure you think about the future of what you're testing as you're choosing your tools. That might mean, bringing the senior developer in, or in the case of a vendor tool, might mean, asking them what their long-term plans are, et cetera. And then the other thing that can sometimes be missed when you're doing a proof of concept is what I call the boundaries of the tool. Meaning, like, how do you start the tool? And how does the tool report? And how does that fit into your overall quality management system? So, these days, right, we spend a lot of time talking with customers how to integrate test automation into their DevOps process. And so that's like, how do you trigger it? Is it triggered on a deployment? Is it triggered on a build? Is it triggered on some other activity that happens, sort of post-deployment? What environments do you want to trigger that on? Very important piece. And some tools, when you're doing a proof of concept, you'll find that like they need somebody to sit at a console for the tool and kick it off manually. So that doesn't fit very well with most DevOps processes. So if you're going to implement in DevOps, that might be a negative mark on that particular tool. And then the reporting. One of the last things you want, right, is that you've got all this quality management reporting of your manual testing and your UAT and your requirements analysis and everything else. And then you've got this weird set of automated test results that sit somewhere else. So integrating the test automation results into your normal reporting process is important. Now, sometimes you might find that automated, tools have really good reporting. And so you want to change your organization in such a way that you're conforming to that as opposed to making the tool conform to you. But keep it in mind as you're looking at tools, and make sure you're choosing tools that are flexible. And then, last but not least, how much time is it going to take to interact with the automation? So this goes into that console thing, or is there like a manual activity that has to happen after it where you're grabbing zip files and images and such, this, that, and the other off of one report and kind of pasting them into another? Just keep in mind, right? Like that manual effort that you were trying to replace is now being replaced by manual effort of managing your automation. And then keep an eye on long-term maintenance. A lot of tools have, built-in abilities to recover from small changes to the user interface or small changes to the API. And if that's like the primary effort that's going into your application, often you might not even decide to automate those things because they're changing too often, but you might be able to choose a tool that can shore up that gap. So take a look at those things. At the end of the day, what we recommend is that you create kind of an approved products list of of tools. What this does is one of the challenges we see with a lot of clients is that, you know, they might have 4 or 5 projects and they've got 4 or 5 different automated tools that are kind of doing the same thing. So some of their folks are using Selenium, some of their folks are testing right out of Visual Studio, some folks are, you know, using LeapWork, or you know, so each time that an automator chose a tool, they weren't like choosing one that was organization wide. And the challenges there are pretty large in terms of like who can code review that, right? And how do you get best practices going? So, you know, be tool agnostic, but develop your experience with the tools. Make sure that you're choosing tools that fit with your entire enterprise, and then choose tools that are going to be flexible for that enterprise, and then cross-train folks on it. So I just, you know, the tool choice is immense. You can, you know, I put Selenium and Appium up, but this is an example of like, you know, one potential client's, you know, set of tools. But, you know, you've got a multitude of choices that you can make at the UI area, on the API area, on the unit testing area. You also have some tools that are better at testing certain types of apps. So, you know, don't limit yourself. You know, if you're writing JavaScript code, obviously, you know, using Mocha or something like that is kind of where you want to be. But, you know, limit down the set of tools that you allow your developers to use so that they can share their knowledge with each other. Keep those tools up to date. A lot of these that are on here are open source, but, you know, there's plenty of non-open source tools that are great as well. And make sure that you're continuously training those developers on the state of the art with that tool. I'll pick on a partner of ours, Eggplant. You know, they do a lot of good work. They're constantly improving their tool, and so making sure that your test automation team is aware of what's happening with that tool is an important part of making sure that you squeeze every last drop of value that you can out of it. So the other thing to keep in mind is tools don't always map the kind of way I have them mapped here into the testing pyramid. A good example of that is UFT. UFT can provide benefits, you know, at the UI side, on the integration side, and the API side, and you know, not so much in the ClearBox and unit testing side, but certainly throughout, you know, the testing pyramid itself. So, you know, use the capability when you can of that tool, because a lot of times what you'll find is you can share test data, generation, et cetera, on that tool across a number of different areas inside the test pyramid. And then finally, the way that you manage the output of these tools and the way that you manage your exploratory manual testing in UAT is important. You know, using tools like Microsoft Azure DevOps or TestRail, or, you know, whatever you have, making sure that the reporting is kind of integrated between what activities your manual testers are doing, what your automation is generating, that those build on each other and that they're not in separate locations and causing, you know, more looking up of test results, et cetera, than you'd like to see. So a few other considerations on the development method is around, you know, not necessarily SDLC things, but some considerations to take into account. So if you own product development, you can start deciding things like behavior-driven development or test-driven development. Frankly, we don't see a lot of customers using TDD. It's not to say that it doesn't exist. It tends to exist more in a highly regulated space, or, you know, folks that are implementing extreme programming and pair programming, for example. Behavior-driven development, though, is actually quite popular. especially since using tools like Cucumber and SpecFlow allow you to fundamentally specify your test case in such a way that a tool can take that test case and figure out what the automation fundamentals need to be, and then you just have to go in and write the root automations for those fundamentals. So if you own those things, if you own product development, highly recommend you take a look at BDD and figure out if that's right for your organization, because it can be an extreme lever for getting automation done quickly. And it has, impact even on manual testing. It's a great specification for requirements and the way that your manual testers and even your UAT folks interact with the testing process. Now, if you've got a vendor developed product, or maybe you've got like a set of really robust existing test cases, a lot of times the activity that we talk about there is what we call manual test case decomposition. So what we're doing there is that we're not dissolving your test cases, but we're kind of pulling out the pieces that you're doing manually, figuring out where there are repeated areas of that, making those automation fundamentals, and then feeding them back into a new automated process that takes those granular pieces into account. It was kind of a long-winded way of saying we're making what used to work for a human in terms of process into a process that's going to work for automation and is going to reduce the amount of maintenance and code kind of work that you have to do to try to get as efficient as you can for your automation. And then again, you do need to strongly recommend you choose a life cycle method, whether that's agile or waterfall, and what version of those you use almost doesn't matter as long as your automation developers know what that is. So, automation quality review. Because automation development can sometimes be a bit, not an afterthought, but it's often not considered to be quite as important as developing the product itself. We don't find that a lot of our clients are doing quality reviews of the automation code itself, and we think that that's a big gap. Strongly recommend that you do peer code reviews, as well as code review sessions on the automation itself. This helps in the training side, but it also drives efficiency and best practices. So expert code reviews, right? So these are the top automators in your team, kind of looking at everybody's code and saying, well, I thought we had decided we were going to use this kind of method because it's going to save us on maintenance, and you didn't use that. As well as recommendations, and if people are stuck and need ideas. That can also, like I said, kind of drive whether or not your automated team is using the best practices as you've put them forward in your training and coaching. One of the things that often happens is team members move, and you don't want to be stuck with an automation that doesn't have good documentation, good code comments, and isn't standard in terms of the way that those comments are delivered. So, the code review can actually go in there, make sure that code clarity is in place, that the code reuse is being done, and that the automators are following the best practices that you've set forward. The other thing that often comes up during code review is the automator kind of understands the process, and they've automated that process, but they don't really know what the best way to report and log that might be. Especially since, if you're integrating into DevOps, or you've got some sort of standardized like total project reporting, you want to make sure that you've got the layers of report from the automation that are coming out that allow someone to go in and triage the issue and debug it, but also provide the right kind of top level information about the failure or passing that allows the reporting to work. So, that integrating with your QA/QC process is an important aspect, and is typically one of the things that is reviewed and is found during a review as being lacking. And then, taking a look at code coverage, feature coverage, requirement coverage, and doing your requirements traceability and making sure that that's here and is being properly recorded and traced is important. So taking a look at that during your automation quality review allows you to kind of grade your success there and measure as you're implementing that, where you are on the continuum. So one of the things that we typically do is help customers develop checklists, right? So these checklists are one of the things that the code reviewers go through. This is just an example of one of those, right? Looking for typos and formatting issues, making sure that like hard-coded values are pulled out. That's one of the things that like junior automators tend to do quite a bit of, because that gap between making it initially work and making it be easily maintained can sometimes, they're in crunch time trying to get the automation done, and so they leave those hard-coded values in there. So code review kind of turns those up and gives you an activity of fixing those things, making sure that you've got the coverage on the test cases and the user stories that you need to have, making sure that like you're organized, your code correctly and according to best practices. So what these checklists do, right? And typically these checklists are developed by your most senior automation resources. Give you something to aim for when you're doing the code review. Did you check off all of these things? Yes, things look good. No, this could use a little bit of help, et cetera, et cetera. And out of these can sometimes come additional scope for automation that becomes part of your automation maintenance. But again, is really there to make sure that you don't wind up way behind the 8 ball in terms of technical debt on your automation. The other thing that code reviews tend to turn up, and so we make it part of this checklist, are duplication issues, right? Two automators that are automating fundamentally the same thing didn't realize that they were both kind of inventing the wheel at the same time. So, making sure, and the reviewers typically see a lot more of the automation than, individual automators do. So, getting rid of those duplication issues is an important piece of this as well. And then the final piece here is measurement. So, right, even a wildly successful automation can run afoul of being defunded because you don't properly measure what the benefit is. So you've got your baseline that you developed during your workshops. Maybe that baseline is slowly changed over time as you developed your automation, as you figured out where more benefit would be. Maybe as you changed what your deployment models were going to be, right? We're now deploying, every sprint into production as opposed to, once every 4 months or those types of things. So keep track of where the automation is doing it. And I often recommend that customers say, okay, if we were doing these automated activities manually, what would that cost? Because that might be where you wind up if you don't maintain, you get into an ice cream situation and the automation starts to drive less and less value because people don't trust it. It generates tons of false positives in terms of failures, but it's really issues with the automation. You didn't maintain it, and you didn't maintain it because you didn't have the budget to maintain it. So now you're back in the manual world and you're doing all of those activities manually. Make sure you measure those maintenance expenses, right? Put them into a category. How much is it costing you to maintain? Can you do a better job at writing more maintainable code? Really important on automation. Take a look at your test execution rates, right? Those are typically going to go way, way up when you start to implement automation. That's almost always one of the goals, if not the goal. Look at how those are improving over time, and make sure that you are reporting what the business value of that is, because, having everyone understand that the automation is already run and found all of the kind of dumb mistakes, whether those are configuration mistakes or really kind of, bugs that shouldn't have made it past development, but did. Getting your UAT folks and your manual folks to understand that those things should not be there because the automation is already run is a huge benefit to your manual test execution as well. Measure your false positive and negative rates. So if the automation is missing something that a manual tester finds, that should be considered as something to be added to the automation. If the automation continually says this is a failure, but isn't really a failure once it gets triaged, you probably just want to drop that from your automation suite until you fix it, because those false positives are one of the banes of existence for automations. When the team does not trust the automation results and they don't feel like it's driving value, they don't even bother to look at it. And so you stop triaging all the issues because you're like, oh, I think it's 50. I think there's 50 failures every time we run it, and it's 52. Maybe there are 2 really important failures that it just found. So make sure you're grooming your automation and taking those out and measuring those rates is a very important way of doing that. And then kind of start to try to measure as much as you can how long a bug has existed before it was found by the automation, to see if you really are shifting left, and to kind of help quantify the benefits of that. So, we typically even do as much as this, right? So this is a workshop kind of thing that we do, but it basically says, all right, how much does an automation engineer cost? How much does a manual tester cost? How much went into the initial investment of the automation? How much are we spending on an automation engineer standpoint on a daily, monthly basis to maintain the automation, and how much manual testing, or how much is a manual tester having to triage those issues that the automation found? So keeping these tables of what your value is the types of things that you want to drive from a measurement standpoint, and creating dashboards for the team to take a look at those things and find issues, outlier issues, is very important. All right. So that's that. So in summary, right, take a measured approach to automation. Make sure that you figured out what your automation goals are and how you're going to meet them before you actually even start coding it. Make sure you pick good targets. Just a little anecdote, right? A lot of times the first targets that we see during workshops that we conduct for clients are things that the manual testers don't spend a lot of time doing, but they hate doing. Those don't usually make good automation targets, because the reason why the manual testers hate them is that they're very difficult, require a lot of thought, that type of thing, and they'd rather just get that off their plate. But automation isn't very good at that. And then the other thing is they might not spend much time doing it. You really want to set yourself up for success by choosing the right targets that are going to meet your automation goals. Implement a process and training. Make sure that your engineers are aware of what your policies are, your processes are, and make sure that they're driving towards the best possible automation that you can build for yourself. Measure everything, measure it all the time, report on it. Don't be afraid of reporting false positives. It's important to make sure that you're capturing that so you can take an action on it. So with that being said, good luck on automation projects. And Virginia, maybe we can take some questions now.
Sure. We will get to the questions now. So let's see. The first question is, do I have to do all of the PyPiece processes myself, or can those be passed off to a third party or to Olenek?
That's a great question. Well, thanks. That's kind of a little bit of a softball there. Yeah, so first of all, you don't have to implement all the Py process at all, right? You can choose for your organization which pieces of that. Obviously, they interact with each other, and so they build upon each other, and they make, one piece of this pie makes the other pieces more successful. But you can do pieces, you can outsource pieces, and you can decide to implement some of these pieces later. Like the measurement stuff, sometimes that is kind of falls to the wayside. And again, right, I spent 10 minutes talking about how that's important, and it is. But you don't have to try to boil the ocean on this and get the entire pie going on day one. You really can take a measured approach and just have in your vision that you're going to implement those things. And if you've decided that you're going to outsource pieces of it, that's great. But make sure that whoever you outsource it to is falling in line with the way that you want to drive value in automation.
Okay, thank you. And then we have another one. So do you think it is important to enable non-developers to build automated testing? Isn't it expected that the development team does this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think over time, and you saw my history, and I got started in doing test automation in the early 90s. So God, and the tools were very rudimentary then, as you can imagine. The tools are getting better and better at enabling not just manual testers, but even like BA types to be able to write certain types of automation. I think it's important to realize what that type of resource is capable of. So if you think about the testing pyramid, your manual testers or BAs might be really good at writing that user interface level automation, but would certainly struggle writing unit tests. It doesn't make a lot of sense, right? The development team can be a really good source for writing your unit tests, which that's where it belongs. They should be writing unit tests on the methods and functions that they write. But they may also be really good candidates for writing API level tests because they just understand how to parse XML and JSON files and kind of some of the fundamentals that are going to be necessary that might take a while to train a non-developer. So I think it's a little bit about where that is, but you can certainly train a developer, to test all the way up the stack. And, given some development fundamentals, you can train, a manual tester or even a BA, depending on the tool that you've got to test pretty far down the stack all the way, certainly down into API testing.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple more. So how can you determine how often automated testing needs to be used to justify the time and expense of building it? Is it different based on the type of testing?
I don't know that it matters that much on the type of testing, but there are a couple of things that come into play here. One is how often you're doing the manual testing that you're replacing, or if you're even doing that manual testing, and what is the business value of doing that automation? One of the things that I often consult with customers on is if you're not going to listen to your QA department when they say that there's a bug, and if you're going to deploy anyway, what's the point of having them? So it's kind of the same thing with the automation, right? If you're not going to listen to that automation, if you're going to trust it, you might not want to do it. But I think that the calculus of figuring out how much automation to do and what the savings is really kind of fundamental, right? It's how much time did it take you to write the automation? How much time are you spending maintaining that automation on a go forward basis? You figure you have to maintain that automation for as long as you plan to run it. And as soon as you stop running it, the value of that automation drops to zero. So you have to maintain it. And then you actually have activities around that automation that don't go away just because it's automated. These are like, hey, it turned up a failure. Someone's got to go in and triage and look at the screenshots and tell what kind of issue it is. So you need to, as soon as you calculate that, that's your automation investment. That's how much effort you're spending on it. Now, on the other side, you're saying, okay, how would we be doing that activity if we weren't doing it in an automated fashion? If we're doing it manually, or if we weren't doing it, what is the business risk of not doing that testing? And, weigh that against the cost of the automation. And what is the effort that would go into it to do manual testing? A lot of folks that go through this automation enablement with us, a lot of our clients, they're moving from a mode where they were kind of deploying every 4 to 6 months code changes, and their manual team could keep up with that, right? They had a more waterfall type of method of testing those production deployments, and thus they could kind of put together a giant manual effort of 10, 15 manual testers and like really just crunch at it for 4 to 6 weeks or whatever and get it done. Now those organizations are looking at methods where they can start deploying, quarterly or monthly or even every sprint. That manual effort can't keep up with it, especially on the regression side. So just the idea that you want to move to that has a whole number of business ramifications. There's reasons why you're moving to that cadence of deployment. You can't get that level of deployment without having at least some amount of automation in your testing. Otherwise, you're probably not doing a lot of testing.
Okay, and for the last question we have, When does it make sense to purchase an automation tool from a testing tool vendor versus using open source frameworks, and how can we determine that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had a magic bullet on it. I think there are a couple of things that come into play, right? So first of all, you can buy a lot of these open source tools with like support and maintenance. So you can actually pay to overcome some of the shortcomings of open source. The shortcomings of open source typically are around support, right? And you also can be worried about some of them, like if they fall out of favor with the community, they might no longer be maintained, et cetera. Whereas if you're paying for a tool, you've got some reasonable expectation that the company that you're buying it from is going to maintain that thing. I think it really comes into that POC. So I talked a bit about choosing the right tool and making sure that it's flexible enough. So you're going to want to look at that regardless of whether it's open source or closed source, and whether you're buying it with a maintenance contract or you're not buying it with a maintenance contract. One of the things to keep in mind is licensing a commercial tool is actually going to be part of that expense that I talked about, part of that maintenance expense. Just to keep your automation tool going for a paid tool costs some amount of money. And that money, you think about it, is that going to be, is that more or less than, kind of training yourself up on open source? So I don't know that there's a too much of a pat answer there, but the economics of open source are very complex, and trying to figure out what works well for your company are usually around training and support. So that was the last question, Virginia?
That was it for the questions.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I wanted to kind of give a shout out to, the various account managers at Olenek that can help. If you have any kind of follow-up questions, certainly reach out to these folks here, and they'll either answer the question or they get the question to me, and I'll make sure that it gets answered.
Yep. And as I mentioned at the beginning too, the session will be made available on the Olenek website. So thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.